Welcome back, life science learners, to the next part of our lesson today. In our lesson, we're going to continue focusing on revision of the human reproductive system. In this segment, we're going to focus on the menstrual cycle and the ovulation and the hormones associated with that. Let's look at the menstrual cycle and ovulation and hormones that are responsible for controlling these processes. The graphs showing the relationship between the ovarian and uterine cycles as well as hormone levels during each cycle are presented on the next slide. So as we look at these graphs, it shows you the level of hormones and various processes occurring. So guys, the best way to remember and revise this section is using a graph like this, because this is a comprehensive graph that shows you various structures and processes occurring along with the processes that occur over a period of time. So I often remind the learners at school to refer to these graphs and use this as a consolidation of all of that process. So there are various processes indicated along the y-axis. We'll refer to that in a bit, but it's important that we understand what is on the x-axis. So on the x-axis, we've got the duration of the cycle from day 0 to day 1 all the way to day 28, with the midpoint being day 14 here. And this shows you various structures and it gives you a sense of what has happened over the first 14 days and then over the next 14 days. If we look right on the top, it shows you the development of structures within the ovary, so we refer to that as the ovarian cycle, and this points out the development of the primary follicle all the way developing into a mature grafton follicle, and then the process of ovulation where an ova is released. Let's look at a bigger version of this graph. If we look right on the top and we look at the y-axis and we look at various structures indicated along that, and this essentially shows you the ovarian cycle. So essentially what is happening within the ovary. And it's important that we recognize that within the ovary we have the follicle that's developing, and that develops from a primary follicle all the way into a mature grafton follicle, which takes around 14 days, and we find the process of ovulation occurring here, which is indicated there. All of these are influenced by hormones, which we would look at in a little while. And then obviously over the next 14 days we see the development of the corpus luteum, which is then maintained for the rest of that 14 days, all up until day 28. Further down, there's also an indication of the body temperature, and what's unique about body temperature is that just before ovulation we see an increase in the body temperature, and this is approximately 1.5 degrees where the body temperature increases slightly above normal body temperature, and that is maintained for the rest of that 14 days, and then you find that when the next cycle begins the temperature drops. Further down we see the pituitary hormones, and these hormones are the two hormones released from the pituitary gland, which was FSH and LH. And so it's important that we understand that the release of FSH stimulates the development of that follicle. So the light blue line that we're looking at stimulates the development of the follicle, and it's important that we recognize that around this period, around day 12, we find that there's a rapid increase in the other pituitary hormone called LH, and that is linked to, again, the process of ovulation. Further down, we look at the ovarian hormones. So these are the hormones produced from the ovary. There are two hormones that are produced from the ovary, guys, estrogen and progesterone. So we know that as the follicle develops, we see that there's an increase in the estrogen levels, and then once ovulation takes place, we see there's a rapid increase in the other hormone, progesterone levels. And so we find there's a decrease around estrogen at day 14, and that's got to do with the digression or the rupturing of the grafton follicle, but we see that LH level tends to continue, and that is stimulated by the corpus luteum. Right at the bottom, we see a graph illustrating the thickness. So this is a measure of the thickness of the endometrium, and the first bit shows you the thinning of that or the shredding away of that, and that is referred to as menstruation. And then further on we see the thickening of that, and then we see how that is maintained over the next 14 days. And so we refer to that being maintained by the hormone progesterone. So guys, it's important that you see the interdependence between the various structures, the various processes, and how they are linked to each other over the 28-day cycle. So having done that, let's take a few questions on this and let's see if we can understand the applications of this in a better way. Right, so the graph below shows the levels of hormones, estrogen and progesterone in a pregnant woman. And that's important that we recognize that the question refers to a pregnant woman. And so we know that pregnancy is maintained by the level of progesterone, and that's something that you must always remember. And so during pregnancy, there's no ovulation. So it means that we find that the endometrium now needs to be maintained. There's no menstruation, there's no ovulation as well. So these are the key things that you got to remember about being pregnant. So let's look at what happens over the next 28 days. So we know that the average cycle is about 28 days. We see that initially the units of these hormones are illustrated in arbitrary units, and these are hormones that are produced from day 1 all the way up until day 14. And we find that estrogen, which is indicated in the dark blue line, tends to increase around day 14, and that's we mentioned, and then decreases because of the release of the Graafian follicle releasing the ovum that causes the rupturing of that. But what we note is that after the corpus luteum forms, there's an increase in progesterone levels. Okay, having noted that the woman is pregnant, we notice that at day 28, the level of progesterone will continue to remain high. If this was a lady that was not pregnant, you would have noticed that there would have been a decrease in that. So that's an interesting question that we're going to look at. So when are the levels of estrogen and progesterone the same? And that's again referring to the graph. So let's point out to the graph. So if we look at the levels of estrogen and progesterone, there are 2 points where these lines intersect. The one point is here and the other point is here. I know that many of you will probably go with this because that's the more distinct point, and that's around day 17. But it's important that we also recognize that there is a point here where they do intersect, and that's around day 7 or day 6.5. So we're seeing 2 points at which they intersect, and I'm sure that you'll be given the benefit of that if you used both day 17 as well as day 6.5 or day 7. Okay, how much estrogen is in the blood on day 14? Again, guys, around day 14, we've got to be able to use our rulers and extrapolate. And the hormone we're referring to is estrogen. So if you go up all the way to estrogen, you've got to use your ruler and extrapolate that. And that's around 33 units. And so it's important that we recognize what unit is given. And here it refers to arbitrary units, but we'll give that arbitrary units as a measure of unit. Okay, so guys, that's an overview of this section. We've looked at the hormones. We've tried to interact with graphs and see how the interrelatedness occurs. This was a short question on some of these hormones. You guys have a little break, and when we get back, we will tackle more questions on these hormones in the menstrual and the ovulation cycles. Quick break, and I'll see you back in a little while.